We're going to get started. My name's Sharon Fagan. I'm the Executive Director of the Shared Use Mobility Center. And I just want to welcome all of you here to the Human Services Transportation Making Mobility as a Service Universal workshop. And we're delighted to have all of you join. As you may perhaps recall, we originally scheduled this workshop to occur at our summit, which was scheduled for March, that then had to be canceled and then was recreated as a virtual summit. And we held out with this workshop to hold it as a standalone event. And since then, we've added a number of panelists. It's gone through different iterations. And I think we have a terrific lineup and a lot of great work that's gone into this incredibly important topic. I just want to thank the staff that worked on it, Al, Israel, and Rudy. They were our team for the virtual summit, so they're not only content, but also the technology as well to make this all work and put it together. And they've put a lot of effort into it. And I also want to thank Jana, our board member at the Shared Use Mobility Center, and all of the panelists who are participating. And now I will turn it over to Al Benedict from our staff, who will explain what's going to happen today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. And thank you for the panel and everyone for attending today. I know these are particularly difficult times and as a country as we work through racial equity and transportation, providing essential mobility services in our communities, cities, and regions as a whole. And for these reasons, I think it's important for us to continue this discussion and dialogue and to discuss what it takes to create a universal transportation system, one that serves everyone equitably and regardless of income, race, or accessibility need. So, as Sharon mentioned, my name is Al Benedict. I'm the research manager at the Shared Use Mobility Center. SUMC, we've been involved in human transportation services and MaaS for some time now. We're beginning to look at the intersection of those two and what's needed, and asking questions what's needed to really create a universal transportation system. And this workshop and this great panel of experts that we've assembled is really part of those efforts to dig down and see what it takes and how can we do it. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. So this session is going to be split up into two parts. The first is going to be led by Jana Lynott. She's the Senior Policy Strategic Advisor for AARP and also a recent SUMC board member. She is going to lead a panel discussion, and that'll end at 2:15. And then immediately following that, we are going to close the session and then launch a new session. And that everyone should have it's a Zoom meeting link, and everyone should have gotten an email with that link on Tuesday. If you don't have it, that's okay. We will post it in the chat box. But that'll give us the opportunity to, that second part of the workshop, to have a discussion and break out into smaller groups and discuss what it would take to develop a universal transportation system in your community. Some other housekeeping items before we get started. The session will be closed captioned. If you click on the CC on the bottom of your screen, you can access that. If you have any questions, send a chat to myself or to the panel, and we can work with you on that. And the chat box is going to be open throughout the session. Feel free to use it and comment on it, but we are going to reserve, questions please reserve for the Q&A box. So we won't be monitoring the chat for questions. And finally, we have a resource page that we put together that has many of the resources that we'll be discussing today in the panel and in the breakout groups, including the presentations that are given today, the slides. We have some definitions that some basic definitions in terms of mobility as a service, universal mobility as a service, so we're all kind of starting from the same place. In addition, the instructions for the breakout groups will also be listed, and And that is where we'll host the recording for the session. So that page will live beyond today's workshop. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jana, and she's going to give a brief introduction on University Mobility as a Service, and then we'll launch right into our panel discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Jana. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Al. So I'm delighted to see such a large turnout despite COVID, or perhaps because of COVID. And I say the latter because I think our current situation puts pressure on all of us to quickly improve our demand responsive services so that they can provide safe alternatives for all community members to get them to healthcare, jobs, services, and civic and social engagement opportunities. Anything we do now to improve these services will benefit older adults, people with disabilities, and rural residents down the road. So what is the problem we are trying to solve? Well, for years, we've been talking about human services coordination with limited success. Data standards and specifications are the ticket forward to enable the services most tailored to the needs of people who rely on demand responsive transportation to become part of, to really enable the services most tailored to these individuals' needs to become part of emerging mobility as a service ecosystems. What this means for the customer is that she would no longer have to make a reservation 24 to 48 hours in advance through one reservation agent and then turn around and make the second leg of her trip reservation through another agent in another system. It's about putting all the providers together under a single system and become closer to real-time convenience. So what is MaaS? And let me just briefly interrupt here. Is the presentation showing for others? Because I'm not seeing it. Okay, so thank you. So I think a lot of folks on the call today are familiar with the concept of mobility as a service, but essentially we're talking about one-stop shopping where people can discover their trip options, schedule a trip, complete that trip, pay for the trip, all within a single platform system. And in this session today, we want to emphasize the concept of universal. And that really involves incorporating universal design into all aspects of the system. And why is that important? Well, because today we have a two-class transportation system. It's inequitable. It means that folks who live in urban areas and who don't really have mobility limitations have access to generally a fairly wide range of transportation options. But for folks who live in rural areas who may depend on public transportation, or for others who have some mobility limitations, they really don't have the same level of service that the rest of us enjoy. And we need to change that. So how do we get there? If you could flip through a few slides. And so next slide, please. So we want to start by modernizing human services transportation through a standardized way of sharing trip data. And some of the foundation has been laid for this. The Transit Cooperative Research Program released Report 210 this past November. And as part of that, they provided code called the Transactional Data Specification for Demand Responsive Transportation. And there's some links to that report on your resource page, as well as some summary documentation that you can become more familiar with. But the basics of this is today, our demand responsive transportation trip cycle, it's often not automated, or if it is, each provider has their own trip scheduling software that doesn't easily interoperate with the systems used by other providers in the community. This creates a huge barrier for coordination. Transactional data specs provide the code to interoperate those distinct systems, taking it through all steps of the trip cycle, from reservation to scheduling, performing the trip, as well as the financial transactions. So next slide. Today, so the transactional data specification alone does not get us to universal mobility as a service, but it's a crucial component. Viewed within an open universal mobility as a service platform architecture, which is shown in this slide, it constitutes the red plugs that allow for the integration of all of the DRT providers in a region. So that includes not only public and nonprofit human service transportation providers, but also your privately provided demand responsive services, such as TNCs and taxis. Now, to provide more explanation of what this transactional data specification is, I want to explain what it is not and go through 5 common myths that I hear when I talk to people about the specification. So the first myth is that the transactional data spec is software. It's not. It's that code that integrates the different software platforms of different systems that allows them to interoperate. The second myth is that the transactional data spec is the GTFS flex. It's not. GTFS, the General Transit Feed Specification, is what allows you to whip out your smartphone and look up real-time bus and rail information. It provides that fixed route public transportation information you need in order to plan your travel. The GTFS Flex now allows transit agencies to put their data into a format so that if they offer demand responsive services, those too become available for customers to view through trip planning applications. But it does not allow those customers to schedule a trip, nor does it integrate the different providers within the region. The transactional data specification is just that. It allows those trips to transact. The third myth is that the transactional data spec is just another API, or application programming interface. Now, APIs are made up of a set of specifications between 2 computer systems or applications. They come into play, or data specifications come into play, to assure that once delivered through the internet, the information can be understood by all parties' systems. Uber, as an example, has an API that is open in the sense that documentation for how it works is publicly available, but it's closed or proprietary in the sense that Lyft or another transportation provider cannot also use it to present their services. Any entity wanting to access the services of multiple ride-hailing companies will need to design their MaaS systems to work with each and every API involved. And this gets very costly. The goal of the transactional data specification is to create an API that is more truly open that all providers can use. And when we have this standardized way of sharing trip data, the use of proprietary APIs would not be needed. The fourth myth is that to interoperate demand responsive services, a transportation provider or technology company would need to share all their data about the customer. That's not true. And myth 5, and related to 4, is that Medicaid or other non-emergency medical transportation providers cannot participate in an open MaaS system because doing so would violate HIPAA requirements. The response to that is that open in this context does not mean that the data exchange would be open to the public. Just like the healthcare sector is finding ways to share clinical data about a patient among healthcare providers, so too can transportation providers share limited trip data about customers through a secure system. So the transactional data spec, and if you can go to the next slide, is based on a standard being used quite widely in Scandinavian countries called the SUDI standard. The transactional data spec is a very simplified version of this, you could think. And I just want to highlight just a couple of things. Denmark is probably the country or with the most sophisticated integrated demand responsive transportation services. And I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but there are links to AARP's Future of Transport webpage that have videos on Flex Denmark, as well as an article, and you can get more information. But I do want to highlight the fact that because of their use of a data standard to integrate these different services, they're able to integrate and have done so for more than 550 private sector transportation providers across the entire country. So with that basic introduction, I want to now introduce our panel of speakers. So next slide, please. First, Judy Shanley, who is with Easterseals and is also the director of the National Center for Mobility Management. NCMM has been at the forefront of providing human services transportation providers and other stakeholders with the technical assistance they need to improve the coordination of human services transportation. Roger Teal is co-founder of DemandTrans Solutions and principal investigator for the TCRP study. Joseph Jahn is the Transportation Technology Administrator for the Atlanta Regional Commission. Arks has already put in place a one-call, one-click center to help customers identify their transportation options, and they're now working to build off of that and implement a mobility as a service platform. Catherine Freund is founder and president of ITN America. ITN is the nation's largest volunteer-provided nonprofit membership organization that matches older adults and volunteer drivers using a technology platform, and it has affiliates in 13 counties across 12 states. Danielle Nelson is the Coordinating Council on Access and Mobility Lead with the Office of Program Management for Rural and Targeted Programs at the Federal Transit Administration in Washington, and she'll share some of the latest work of the CCAM. And Susan Weber is a community planner with the Federal Transit Administration Region 5, and will share how FTA is positioned to support the concept of mobility as a service. So with that, I wanted to turn to Judy for the first question and ask if you could just quickly describe the work of NCMM, define mobility management, and how mobility management relates to universal mobility as a service.
Sure. Thanks, Jana, and thanks to SUMC for organizing this panel. It's been a terrific experience. I'm calling in from Chicago, Illinois, where it's actually warm. I don't get to say that too often. So thank you to all of you for participating in this. I hope many of you have tapped into the National Center for Mobility Management's resources. I'll call it NCMM. We are a technical assistance center funded by the Federal Transit Administration, and our work really is to help build coordination and mobility management, particularly for individuals with disabilities, those with low income, and older adults. And it's a consortium of 3 organizations. I'm actually the Easterseals director. I'm not the overall director of the project. Amy Conrick from CTA is the overall director, and we have APTA as a partner as well. So let me just talk. I developed a graphic because I felt like that was an easy way to see the relationship between mobility management and MaaS. I often hear when I'm providing technical assistance, the field is often confused by the two. And so I thought graphically with a flow chart, it would be easier to explain the relation. We all know that riders need access to a variety of places: employment, education, healthcare, and they have the opportunity in many cases to use multiple modes. Those modes are funded by different sources, by different federal agencies, private, public funding, but all mobility management in the sense of coordinating these resources, mobility management is really serving as a catalyst to universal MaaS, because mobility management supposes that it's very customer driven, so the needs of users in the community regarding their access to those places are really considered. There's mobility management supposes that the individuals are actually engaged in decision making about the services that are in place in a community. Mobility managers, the profession of mobility management, they're creating an inventory of services and descriptions about who those services can serve and when. So all of those kinds of characteristics can really feed into a MaaS system. Mobility managers use data repeatedly, and those same data, and they share those data, and those same data could be really useful to a MaaS platform. So this is just one vision of how all the pieces fit together. Mobility management isn't a substitute for MaaS, it's really a catalyst and a foundation for MaaS. So we have tons of resources on our website. I hope you access the National Center for Mobility Management's resources and could avail yourself of the technical assistance that we provide. So thanks, Jana.
Thanks, Judy. And just to kind of point folks back to the resource page and the definitions, terminology can really trip us up sometimes, and we can talk past one another. So for instance, we've offered 3 different definitions for mobility management on that resource page. And just to give you a little flavor, there's mobility management from the human services transportation perspective. I think Judy has described that very well. There's also the mobility management from the transit agency perspective. We're hearing a lot of transit agencies talking about becoming the mobility manager for their communities. And I think in that definition, it goes, far beyond just thinking about those with special needs, but also how do we provide transportation to the general public and make sure that we're coordinating all the different ways we get around. And then third, on the technology side, there's mobility management in the sense of taking big data collected about how we each individually travel in the transportation environment and combining that with data about every other person and offering very tailored transportation options. So it's, I think what all of those have in common is an end desire to offer more person-centered transportation. Now, Roger, turning to you, you've spent many years working to improve demand responsive transportation. What's different about the conversation today?
Well, what's different about the conversation today is that really 2 things. One is I guess I call it the mainstreaming of digital platforms to support various transactional processes across different businesses, with businesses and consumers, all of these things. There was a reason that our study for TCRP was called Transactional Data Specifications, because if transactions aren't occurring, essentially nothing of value is really occurring. So the whole idea here then is to finally, after decades in which we've been talking about coordination or integrating services or enabling agencies to do different things, to actually make it happen. And there's many examples out there that we all relate to so much that we may not even really think about it. If you think about using a website like Orbitz or Expedia or their apps, you're doing something that 25 years ago people couldn't do except through the spatialized capabilities of a travel agency. But now that's commonplace. Or if you think of using the Amazon marketplace, which is sort of a fairly incredible thing when you think of that tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of suppliers of goods can interoperate with you via this platform, where you can buy things from all over the planet and it shows up at your doorstep the next day, and somehow all you had to do was click on what credit card you wanted to use to purchase that. But all of that is highly transactional. It's all supported by digital platforms. So the future is here and has been for a long time, but what we haven't been able to do effectively in this sector of transportation is to take advantage of these digital platforms. And with the emphasis on MaaS and the development of these MaaS platforms that we see in various forms over the last 2, 3, 4 years, there's no reason any longer that these sorts of things can't occur. I mean, that doesn't mean that they will occur, but the impediments from a technology standpoint, from a resourcing standpoint, have largely disappeared. And now it's really, can we find the business platform that goes with the digital platform that will make these things happen?
Great, thank you, Roger. Joseph, turning to you, since you're on the ground and really getting a start in implementing what it is we're talking about. Can you share Arks' vision for the future of human services transportation and a couple of the barriers that you've already faced?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you mentioned already, the vision for an on-demand HST platform was there well before I was on staff with ARC. We had some visionary staffers in the past that implemented our one call, one click center called Simply Get There. The vision behind that was that it would be this one-stop shop for HST trip planning, and eventually would become a resource that you could book trips on demand, and that it would interface with MARTA's scheduling and dispatching software. The hope also was that it would it would move beyond MARTA and would really scale to all of our suburban operators as well, and tackle some of those challenges that we have in HST coordination. It never did fully reach that potential though. One reason was because there's not a consistent business process for booking and scheduling and paying for trips between all transit operators in Metro Atlanta. We're addressing that now with an HST coordination implementation plan that will hopefully be done by the end of the year, and we'll address some of those barriers from a business process and a policy standpoint. But the other challenge that we faced there was the lack of data standardization. We could never scale that. It never did interface with MARTA's scheduling and dispatching software. But even if it did, it would have never been in a place where we could really scale that past that into other operators' scheduling and dispatching software as well, because we don't have the data standards in place to do that. I think I included a map on the resource page just to show the scale of what we're trying to operate with and coordinate across Metro Atlanta. Of course, we're known for sprawl, so it's a vast metro area, and we're trying to coordinate demand response between all of these agencies. So the need for the business processes to change is obviously important, but having the technology there is hugely important to get these trips to coordinate together and to share them.
Thanks, Joseph. And I think for folks listening in, your challenges that you faced, I think would resonate with a lot of folks, just that challenge of coordination that exists. Yes. Catherine, turning to you, volunteer provided transportation is crucial. It's a crucial element of human services transportation, but it's rarely mentioned in the context of MaaS. Do you see potential for volunteer transportation to be part of these emerging mobility ecosystems? And if so, what do system designers need to know about volunteer provided services? You're on mute, Catherine.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. I actually do see a way for volunteer transportation to connect with other transportation services. But the first step, I think, is that there needs to be transportation software that the small systems can use. And that means it needs to be available to them, and it needs to be affordable by them. Most volunteer systems are still using a spiral notebook and a pencil next to the telephone, or maybe a spreadsheet. That's not really adequate to the task. So having software is the first step. We, ITN America, recently got a grant from the Federal Transit Administration to implement the software that we use, ITN Ride software, which is specialized for volunteer transportation. We're moving it to the Salesforce platform, which is a very, very robust platform and built for community outreach. In the business world, it's called marketing. In the nonprofit world, it's called community outreach. But Salesforce is built for that. And Esri has donated the routing algorithms for us. And Esri, as some people know, is the largest GIS software company in the world. So it's world-class algorithms and world-class platform. And that means we will be able to make available at what I call bake sale prices. It's unusual for a charitable nonprofit organization to be building software. We've been doing it for over 20 years, and the reason we do it is to make good technology available very, very affordably. And now by moving to Salesforce, we should be able to do that. We plan to use the transactional data specification I've just been reading about it. It looks a little more complicated than I thought it would be, but I think it's very important to do that because, you know, if you think of the transportation system like a vascular system, all the little volunteer organizations, they're the capillaries. In the city, the capillaries might be taxis and Ubers, but out in the country, it's the volunteer services. So I think this could be a very, very useful tool that would really connect a lot and help a lot of people. I'm done.
Okay, I'm sorry, somehow Zoom dropped me momentarily and I hope I'm back. I don't know if other people were having Catherine break up or if it's just my system that is going down, so I'll be ready to take over, I guess. Anyway, I just wanted to reiterate Catherine's point that, you know, rural systems and many volunteer provided transportation systems really lack some of the most basic technology in order to become part of those mobility as a service ecosystems. And AARP is trying to build some of that support up. We have a pilot right now in rural Oregon that will show how this data specification can be integrated with Google Sheets, which is very inexpensive, widely available software that, you know, more nonprofit human services providers have access to. With that said, we also recognize that we have a need for the big software companies like Trapeze, RouteMatch, Ecolane, et cetera, to get on board and really adopt the data specification, because some of our other demand responsive transportation providers are using those software packages. And for interoperability to happen, we're going to need to have a standardized way of sharing data. So with that, back to Roger. What does this group need to know about the transactional data specification?
I think what folks need to understand about it, and you emphasized this a bit in your, you know, your remarks, Jana, is it's really a means to an end. The data specification is simply the, if you will, the language that we need to have so that different systems, services can talk to one another. And it's really sort of nothing more. You mentioned the trip life cycle, and which is a very real thing in transportation, and particularly demand responsive transportation, which I need to book a trip, and then the trip has to be has to be scheduled onto a particular vehicle at a particular time. Then the trip is executed, and then the data from the trip flows back to some central database, and that's the trip life cycle. But of course, if there's multiple participants in this process, that trip life cycle has to span more than one software system, and that's really all that it is. But to be able for it to span more than one software system, these software systems have to be able to share data in a common format. And not only do they have to be able to share it in the common format, let's call that the, you know, the language, but then they also have to understand the same grammar. That is, that this is how a sentence is constructed. So that's really what a transactional data specification is just the sort of the grammar and the sentence construction. We can call it messages. They're being sent with a syntax for those messages. The Flex Denmark system that you referenced in your introductory remarks is really the gold standard model for why data specifications can make fairly amazing things occur. That's a comprehensive system that spans all of Denmark, 6 regions of Denmark. It started in one and gradually expanded elsewhere. It's nationwide. It involves people I sometimes don't, I think when they see that number, 550 service providers, somehow I think their eyes just glaze over. They don't really quite understand what that means. We're talking about 550 companies 550 distinct companies, not the agencies that are responsible to get their clients to wherever they need to go, the actual service providers themselves. All of those companies, all 550 of those companies are plugged in to the Plex Denmark platform. And the only way that could possibly work is with this data specification, the one that you mentioned, the SUDI standard. So by doing so, they have engaged literally every significant transportation provider in the entire country of Denmark in this service. And they can use those different providers as makes sense. They've also made it possible for different ordering systems, not even their own ordering system, to send orders into the Plex Denmark system, as long as those ordering systems can speak SUDI. So, and this goes back to what I was saying before, you still need a business platform. Plex Denmark created its business platform independently of the digital platform, but the digital platform won't be able to work without these specifications, and the specifications are what enable it to do. So on this thing, this schematic that we have up on the screen here, Plex Denmark is essentially all the stuff on the lower right-hand side. All of those things that it needs to deliver the service are plugged into what is essentially this universal MaaS platform. And all of the orange boxes are the multiplicity, the several hundred organizations in Denmark that are plugged into the ordering side of the system, whether they use their ordering system or the Plex Denmark native ordering system is not particularly important. And again, they even now have, made it so that consumers, general public in some of these cities can order services as well. And all of this is connected with this digital platform, but the SUDI standards, the transactional data specifications of Scandinavia are what hold this thing together.
Thanks, Roger. And I would just point out that Denmark has been building this system for 20 years, and so it's very sophisticated. Obviously, here in the United States, where this is still a fairly new concept, we can start simple and we can build out. And I'll be really interested in the later discussions to hear thoughts on different business models that could work for the United States. But now I want to turn to Danielle with FTA. And Danielle, as the CCAM lead at the FTA, you have the challenging job of herding 11 different agencies toward more coordinated transportation services. I'm curious about your latest successes, but first, what is CCAM?
Excellent, thank you, Jana. I put in the chat box, because we say CCAM, but it's the Coordinated Council on Access and Mobility, but in the chat box there, you can click a link. So what it is most of you probably have heard of it as United We Ride for decades, but it was started in 2004 by executive order under George W. Bush. And the purpose is to improve transportation coordination. And as Jana said, across those 11 federal agencies, and 9 of those 11 federal agencies fund 130 different federal programs that may fund human services transportation. And this number keeps growing. Back when the charter rule was published and Appendix A was published, there were 64 programs, and that was 2008. And then the GAO did a study in 2012, and it was 80 programs, so it has grown. And so of those 9 agencies that fund those 130 programs, those are the Departments of Agriculture, Education, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Affairs, Interior, Justice, Labor, Veterans Affairs, and of course, last but not least, the agency that Susan and I work for, the U.S. Department of Transportation, who's also the chair. So thanks, Jana.
Great, Danielle. The FAST Act breathed new life back into the CCAM. Can you talk a bit about CCAM's latest activities?
Sure. So I think the 2 things that most important for this group or most interest, I put the links to them in the chat, but also I'm sure most of people know that we did pilot programs. So between 2016 and then 2020, we've been putting out annual CCAM pilot programs. FTA is the one that publishes the notices of funding opportunity. And just to confuse everybody, each year it had a new name. So in 2016, we called them the Rides to Wellness grants. And then the 2020 grants we're actually going to be announcing tomorrow. And we called those the Mobility for All grants. and there will be another one coming out, a new notice. And then in 2018, something that I'm very proud of is we went around the country and did state focus groups, state and local as well. And we got some great input. We also, thanks to Judy's organization, the National Center for Mobility Management, they did a national survey and provided us with the input on transportation coordination barriers. And the top two that we heard from across the country was the lack of knowledge of what federal programs can actually fund human services transportation. And then the other issue we heard was the ability to use other federal funds as match were two issues. And so that's why we developed the two products that we just published. The Federal Fund Rating Guide, it actually was published yesterday, so it's brand new. You guys are hearing about it before the FTA Gov Delivery Notice goes out. And then the other one was the Program Inventory. And that's the inventory, again, of the 130 different federal programs. And it's searchable Excel spreadsheet, so you can search by. If you're only looking for programs that can fund transportation for people with disabilities, or you're just looking for those 11 programs out of CDC, you can search it, it's great. And then the Federal Fund Rating Guide, what that is we had a meeting with each of our CCAM programs, their lawyers, our lawyers, and we went through 61 of the 130 programs and saw through their statutes what was eligible for match. And so it's really helpful, especially for the rural programs that have a tough problem coming up with that local match. These are programs that you can have 100% federally funded program. And then the last thing I'll just mention is coming soon. We are having concurrence right now, a cost sharing policy statement. It's 3 pages. We worked with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the Veterans Administration, which are the 2 largest funders of non-emergency medical transportation. So it's a helpful policy statement about what you can do in cost sharing. And then lastly, there's a report that's due to Congress and the President that's statutorily required through the FAST Act. And so that is right now in concurrence. And what it does is proposes changes to federal laws and regulations that we heard from you all were barriers to transportation coordination. And so that's what's going on. Thank you, Jana.
Great, thanks Danielle. And I'm so glad that FTA and other agencies were able to kickstart the CCAM work. It's really important work that you all are doing. And you mentioned funding. You mentioned the Mobility for All grant program that you're going to announce tomorrow, I think you said. And I just wanted to make sure that participants are also aware of the Transportation Planning for All grant that's funded by the Administration for Community Living, and it's administered by the, it's kind of made available through the Community Transportation Association of America. And that specifically provides funding for pilots of the transactional data specification for mobility on demand. So I invite participants, if you get excited about what we're talking about today, to check that out and see if you can't put a team together and go after that funding, because we really need pilots of the data specification in order to prove its efficacy and move it along. So turning to Susan. Susan, you're at the ground level working with transit providers in your Region 5. And I'm curious to know where you see the opportunities for these types of human service transportation integrations in your area.
Thanks, Jana. Well, I do have the privilege to get to work with both Danielle and Judy pretty closely, and there are some really exciting things happening, particularly in Region 5. We cover the 5 Great Lakes states, so Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. So I'm going to highlight a few items that we've got going on here, and then also talk about some of the exciting CCAM work that we've gotten to do in partnership with ACF, the Administration of Children and Family Services. So starting out, it really is, I think, important that it's both grassroots and state level participation. That's where we've seen the most success. And I view my role as serving as an intermediary and building these partnerships and relationships and bridging these connections. And you know, there are some states that we've seen that have had some really great success in doing that. Ohio has long been looked at as a huge model for success in their mobility management network. They've been at the forefront, and they have developed a system that is really both, you know, based on rural, urban, you know, statewide support. So they've done some really great work. They began back in 1996, so it hasn't been just an overnight thing to get them to where they are today. But they've had support from the state, which has been huge. They now, you know, are looking at performance measures of the system, and they've developed a number of guides for training their mobility managers that are both in the rural and urban areas across the state. So I would definitely suggest looking at them as a resource. Another success story that I think we can talk about is Michigan. They've done a lot, and they've got currently a mobility challenge across the state of Michigan. So they continue to break barriers there. And in particular, another transit agency that's done a lot of work that FTA looks to a lot is the Flint mass transit transportation system. They right now are working in breaking down those barriers with the Veterans Affairs. There's long been issues with barriers with veterans transportation and regular, even caregivers. So it's exciting to see that work happening in Flint. Wisconsin has a pretty well established organization of access and mobility managers across their state. And most recently, I've been working with Danielle and Judy in the state of Indiana. They have requested a number of meetings with us, and they're looking to really bring mobility management to light. So it's been exciting. We've been partnering with the Federal Highway Administration and the Indiana Department of Transportation, their Office of Civil Rights, and their Office of Transit, and INSILC, which is the statewide Independent Living Council, and FSSA, and they deliver healthcare and social service throughout the state. United Way, the Indiana State Department of Health, and then a couple of local and MPO in Evansville has been really instrumental in helping develop this, along with a non-for-profit agency, Health by Design. So it's really exciting that there's this cross-sector, cross-agency. It's slow in coming, but I think we're building a good foundation, and I think if, as Judy and I often share, if we can and really communicate and establish the return on investment for better coordination, that will make it all the more successful. So those are just some of the examples that I wanted to highlight.
Those are awesome, Susan. And I'm sure that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of when it comes to innovation that's happening around the country. And what I especially noted in your examples is just the importance of that institutional coordination as forming the foundation for everything that we're talking about here. Technology is one piece. It's certainly the simpler piece, but having that institutional coordination is where we have to go as well to make all of this happen. I do have some additional questions for panelists, but Al says that there are a bunch of great questions coming in through the phone, through the Q&A line. So I'm gonna turn to Al to ask a couple of those. And just for others who have questions in your head, but you haven't yet posted to the Q&A, feel free to post those now. Thanks.
Thanks, Jana. So we'll start with this one, and this is really, we can kind of open this up to the panel. How would you convince an agency to get on board with MaaS? what is the benefit of the agency using these specs and sharing their data, participating, and curious specifically how this works in Atlanta and the coordination, how this interacts with the coordination implementation plan. So I guess maybe with that, Joseph, you want to take the first.
Yeah, sure. Well, the short answer of how it's working in Metro Atlanta right now is it's really not. We implemented a one call, one click center to get there, but it never did go past data discovery and trip planning. But through the HST implementation plan specifically, when we have all of our operators in one room and we're talking about what are your barriers right now, one of the biggest things, as far as coordination, one of the biggest things that we are hearing is it's impossible to share those trips across agency border. There are things like common fare types that we're looking at, moving everybody over to Breeze, our fare payment card, our smart card, and doing that for demand response. But right now it's impossible for them to share those trips. If say you're going from a suburban Cobb County into a MARTA territory, Cobb County Transit is unable to share those trips with MARTA without manually doing it, which often means that the rider ends up having to call and schedule trips with Cobb County and with MARTA, and they do the coordination piece. So it's complicated across the board for schedulers and dispatchers and for our riders as well. So having those data standards in place, it's not hard to convince them. We're not using terms like mobility as a service right now, but the idea that someone can book a trip on demand and it be shared across all agencies, and trips can be reconciled through financials after that, and we don't have to worry about that. It's all done through the technology. That's not a tough sell for our transit operators to get on board with.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's great to hear.
Let me just jump in here and just mention quickly, we've worked in Denver for the last few years to working with various organizations there to create what we call a trip exchange, which is I see a variation on this theme. Basically, it allows one transportation provider to make space available in their service for other organizations. At the same time, they may have trips that they aren't able to accommodate, so then yet another organization in the region may have capacity. So the technology which we developed over the course of 2 federally funded projects was not that difficult to create. At the same time, we've been at this for 5 years. So the institutional aspects of it have been far more daunting than building the software platform. And this is not full bore mobility as a service, but it is transactional. It does deal with the financial transactions as well as the trips themselves. So I think this is in many ways a key takeaway from this conversation is that it's really the ability of the organizations to sit down and understand that they have a common objectives, and that by sharing resources, they're all collectively ahead. That was not a hard sell in Denver, but then to translate that into action and the sort of specific reality was a process. And it's not a process that's going to happen in 6 months. I mean, maybe you can get to, a couple steps beyond the starting point. It's a process that takes real commitment by a few key people to make it happen. And like Joseph talks about in Atlanta. I mean, I know Joseph. I've talked to him, and I know he's committed. But without a guy like Joseph or someone comparable, it's really hard to launch these sort of initiatives.
So let me just ask Catherine a quick follow-up.
Sure. I was just going to emphasize Roger's point there, where it does take time. Where we have operators that are on board, it's not going to happen overnight. So sorry, I just wanted to re-emphasize.
And I want to ask Catherine, as ITN, you know, in many ways is a transportation operator in a less traditional sense. And when I spoke with you initially, we had several conversations that I've mentioned this, we talked about it, and you were skeptical that there was really a role for volunteer transportation and mobility as a service ecosystems, or really as part of even the use of a transactional data specification. So I'm just, if you can help us walk through your thinking as to what that was and sort of how you've evolved in thinking about how volunteer transportation might be a participant.
Like, what in the world changed my mind, right?
Exactly.
Well, there are probably two things. ITN's been gathering data on rides for 25 years now, and we've got about 1,300,000 trips in the system, and so that covers 25 years and 20 locations in 26 states. And one of the trip purposes we tracked was intermodal connection. So in 1,300,000 rides, fewer than 1% of trips connected to anything. So, you know, transactional data to connect people isn't going to do any good if they don't really want to connect. Now, you could say it'll make it easier, but even if you tripled it, it would be a very small percent. So that was one of the reasons I was skeptical. But the other one is that, you know, since we gather data, 178 fields, I know that data are proprietary, and I know that data are very important and very valuable. And, you know, we gathered it for research, and it's very important. It helps us understand how people travel. When you talk about sharing data for the greater good, you have to understand that data have a value and people hold on to them. So you have to think about, why would people share those data, and what would be the benefit to the agency that has those data to share. And what I realized that made it, I think, possible, I mean, we're going to look at it now and see if it actually is, but I think it will be, is that you don't have to share all your data in order to share sufficient information to help connect the systems. When you help connect the systems, it seems to me that you help your consumers. And when you help your consumers, you help your business, you help your community. Basically, all boats rise when you do that, if you do it well. And you can do it without giving away the store. So that was my thinking, for what it's worth.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that thought process. I think that's helpful for probably a number of people on the webinar today. Al, any more questions you want to highlight for the panelists? You're on mute, by the way.
There's a bunch of questions, but we could take one more now. Someone's asking us to comment on universal MaaS and how it could be leveraged to provide flexible services in times of emergency, COVID being one, but natural disasters and others, to ensure that people with different access, everyone has, access to transportation, essential mobility services.
Any panelists want to jump in on that?
Well, I'll just jump in a generic sense. I mean, and we've seen this happen in a few cities, that providers of on-demand services have repurposed their services to help, get healthcare workers to and from their jobs and things of this nature. And that only happens if you have a platform-based service. It's not something you're going to do with a few phone calls and this sort of stuff. So, I mean, to me, universal MaaS is really about having platform-based services that allow the services to be plugged into the platform and to allow the transactions to be facilitated through the platform. With that, all sorts of things can happen. Without it, very little can happen that's not ad hoc and very, very human intensive.
Yeah, and I would just point out in communities that have a variety of services available, if they are integrated into a MaaS platform and able to exchange trip data quite readily, I think it offers an opportunity, a couple of advantages. One, you can have contact tracing if you're able to get around the privacy issues that involve that by being able to know who has been on what vehicles and with who. But the other is, you know, if we are going to see continuation of where we really have to space people out on our public transportation vehicles, if we can provide a certain set of services on demand that can actually schedule individuals into seats that provide that spacing, I think that will allow us to better serve the public and all members of the public. And of course, you know, to do that, we need the technology in place. But I think now is a good opportunity to test some of the ways that this can work in communities that are ready.
Mm-hmm.
Jana, this is Judy. Shanley, I also think an important component of all of this to kind of respond to the flexibility and urgent needs that might occur is that the technology be accessible. It's accessible in terms of the technology itself, but accessible in terms of the information that's conveyed about it so that people, diverse learners, can use the technology. So it really is universal. That's just one challenge that when we're talking about MaaS platforms that just always we want to consider is the accessibility in multiple ways.
Yeah, and looking at how can these systems leverage that public information to not only push out timely information to customers, but also as a mechanism for feedback from customers about the system.
Yeah, I'd second that too. If we look at MaaS and these transactional data standards as kind of the base level, and then from there it makes all these efforts easier to coordinate for accessible services in a time of a crisis or just the day-to-day needs of people as well. So it's kind of sets that base to build from.
Exactly. Al, I think we still have a few, maybe what, 5-10 more minutes left before we need to break? And if so, is there another question you want to pose to the group from the Q&A line?
Sure, I can. Let's see, we have, this is from Ronald Gifford. Are there current examples of connected human service transportation systems in US cities that we could look to for best practices and building these businesses and digital platforms in our own communities? Who maybe Jana or Danielle, if you want to take the first.
Well, I would just say that the data specifications, transactional data spec is pretty new, coming out in November, so it really hasn't given communities an opportunity to integrate that yet. There's been a number of activities in different areas of the country to coordinate services. Roger mentioned Denver, and I think that's a really great case study. I know of other examples where they're doing some level of integration, but it still involves some manual labor in order to match different providers. But obviously Danielle and Roger, if you want to jump in and kind of highlight what you know of to be best practices.
I'll jump in just real quickly. I'm not aware of any single metro area in the United States that has anything that we could consider a truly integrated platform, system, whatever, for human service transportation, which 30 years after the start of mobility management, it says a lot right there. There haven't been the resources to build something like this. As I mentioned, in Denver, it's taken two federally funded projects in 5 years to be able to accomplish something where we had a group of committed, dedicated people to do it. So it's not a simple thing to do. It's not hugely expensive, but if you need $500,000 and the other if stakeholders have 50,000, it doesn't happen. So there's a lot of obstacles, none of which are huge in its way, but collectively they make it difficult to achieve what, technologically speaking, is a more than easily achievable objective.
Yeah, that's actually a good follow-up question that we received. So what are the next steps then of this transactional data specification, and how do we see this being rolled out or implemented in cities?
Jana, Jana and I have talked about this a lot, so maybe you want to start.
Sure. Well, I think we have to come at it from a multi-pronged approach. First, I mentioned the need for pilots in order to prove the technology, and I think that's going to be so important. I just really urge my federal colleagues, as well as state program managers, to use the grant funding that we have today to do an investment in pilots of a nationwide method of standardized data sharing. You know, we've been putting a lot of money toward one-off type of innovations, and I think now is the time to really point ourselves in the direction to do this in a more standardized way. Apart from that, I think, and Roger, you know, talks about this a lot, and certainly with our panel, TCRP panel, the need to establish a governance structure, and that's not an easy thing to do, but the data specifications as it exists today is just the first shot at the code that needs to evolve over time, and it needs to have a home of programmers and transportation providers that are going to nourish it and evolve it over time. And you know, we have some great examples, mobility data, for instance, for the GTFS, and there are other types of organizations out there that could take this on, but it does need to have a landing place. Roger, I don't know if you want to add. Those are kind of two highlights for me.
That's really, it's a landing place is really important, and it needs to have what I'll call authority behind it. Authority doesn't mean necessarily that it has to be government backed, but authority means that actors who matter are engaged in promoting it and supporting it. In the SUDI standards in Sweden came about because the national government in Sweden basically said, thou shalt have these specifications, because we don't want the municipalities that are buying software to have vendor lock-in. So this is what has to happen. And then other Scandinavian countries adopted that. That's not likely to happen in the United States, the government activism like that. But what typically happens in the United States is an industry or a subgroup in the industry coalesces around the need for something like this. It could be an industry leader like in software. I mean, Microsoft decides that there's some data specifications because its customers are beating it up. Well, your data needs to talk to this package and it needs to talk to another package, and we have to develop stuff to, to do all these things. Why can't you make a standard or work with your competitors or the organizations that work with your software to come up with something? That happens all the time in the technology industry, totally below the radar screen, but it's very common. So there's authority there. There's a marketplace authority. And that's really what has to happen in the United States if this is going to occur. Organizations that have authority and are willing to put some resources into it have to get on board and promote this. And the specification we developed is not necessarily the final word. It's really an example of how to do it. Other people might have better ideas, and that's great, but someone has to start the process, and at least they have something now that they can, begin to coalesce around something around that.
Yeah, and I would just add that there is precedent for federal leadership in requiring data standards. I mean, if you look at the CMS side and the federal government on healthcare interoperability, there is that federal leadership. It has taken years, but it is going somewhere today. There's also the idea that we can start today writing in requirements for the data specification into procurement. So if you're a transit agency that will be procuring new ride scheduling software, you can put into your RFP that the companies that are going to provide that, interoperate and have the spec integration in place in order to do that. So we'll certainly, we've started conversations with APTA, with CTAA as to how can we provide technical assistance out to transit providers in order to get the right language into those RFPs.